Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Malice in the Mitten. I am your host, Tracy Preston, along with my bestie, Christine Mulligan. Hey, Christine.
Hey, Trace. Hey, everybody. So it's a whole new story today, huh, Trace? We're getting into something completely new?
Yeah, something completely new, and it's absolutely bananas. It's such a horrible story. They're all horrible. I know I say that all the time, but it's like I keep, I think, oh, nothing can top this one, and then boom, there's another one. I'm like, that is just nuts. Before we get rolling with this episode, Christine and I want to give a big thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you to everyone in the United States that's listening, and also a huge thank you to our listeners in Queensland and South Australia, Russia, and Canada this month. So thank you guys. We really appreciate you listening. Keep coming back for more. We are so thankful for all of you. Keep coming back to us, and please spread the word. So with that being said, let's get into it. This is Season 3, Episode 5, David Till and Brian Ognjan. Today's episode is the story of two friends, David Till, who was born on August 21st, 1958, and Brian Ognjan, who was born on January 16th, 1958. David and Brian were very close friends and had grown up together. At the time of their tragedy, they were both 27 years old. David was from Troy and Brian was from St. Clair Shores. Troy is located just east of Sterling Heights, and St. Clair Shores is on the shoreline of Lake St. Clair, east of Warren. The two Detroit area men were bullshitting around when they were telling their friends and girlfriends and wives and loved ones that they were, going to head north because it's deer hunting season and it's the second weekend in Michigan's deer hunting season, that November of 1985. And I say bullshitting because that was a total excuse for them to get away and party it up. Instead of driving northwest 200 miles to David's family's cabin in White Cloud, where they would meet up with David's brother and dad and some other guy friends, David and Brian drove David's black Ford Bronco 190 miles northeast to Mayo in Oscoda County. According to Wikipedia, Oscoda County is the sixth least populated county in the Lower Peninsula, which is the mitten shape of Michigan. The county seat is Mayo, which basically means it's the administrative center or capital city of a civil parish. Glaciers created the unique area and ecosystem. This county is surrounded by the Huron National Forest, and if you drive directly east from Mayo, you'll be at the shores of Lake Huron. So this place is very, very dense with forest. It's unbelievable out there. The two men arrived on November 22nd, which was a Friday night, and they spent much of the weekend drinking heavily, bar hopping, playing pool, and crudely offending women in their path. Neither one of the men had purchased a deer license. Again, that was just an excuse to get away and to just be rowdy, single men, albeit that David was married and Brian had a serious girlfriend. Whatever their ultimate goal was that weekend, they were never seen or heard from again. David worked as a machinist and Brian was a mechanic. They were to return on Sunday night from their, quote, hunting trip, but they didn't come home that night. They also didn't show up for work on Monday, November 25th. To David's wife, she was extremely worried because David would always check in with her, even if he was only going to be a couple of minutes late. She never heard from him that weekend, and when Monday rolled around and she still hadn't heard from her husband, she immediately started making calls and filed a missing persons report. Brian's girlfriend tried that as well, but they wouldn't allow her to make the report because she wasn't family. Both David and Brian's families grew worried because both men were very dependable, and in the days and weeks that followed, both men's families contacted media and prodded law enforcement to help find them. They posted and handed out flyers with photos of the men, as well as David's black Bronco. They had also persuaded TV stations to show their photos and descriptions statewide. False sightings were pouring into the White Cloud area, but David's father, brother, and others that were at the cabin where they were supposed to be said that they had never arrived and just thought that David and Brian changed their minds about coming to the cabin. A man northwest of Mayo confirmed David and Brian had stopped in his driveway to ask directions on Friday, November 22nd. He recognized them from their photos in David's black Ford Bronco. He said they were looking for a high school friend's home near Luzerne, east of Mayo. That friend, the one they told this man they were looking for, said they never arrived and later took a lie detector test, which proved he was being truthful. Police soon corroborated that David and Brian were in the local bars and diners around Mayo the weekend they disappeared. But what they couldn't figure out was where they slept at night or verified if they vanished Saturday night or Sunday night. Several locals noticed two 20-something strangers and pegged them as deer hunters from downstate. After all, hunters surge into Michigan's North Woods during deer season, which runs November 15th through the 30th every year. David and Brian only looked the part. Quote, I wouldn't describe them as serious deer hunters by any means.
Okay, I'm sorry. I have to interrupt.
I know what you're going to say.
And we just talk about how our little new writer friend slipped and pegged them.
She sure did. Good one, Angela.
Slick. I like it.
That one's for you, Nina.
Yeah, that one's for Nina. Okay. All right. Carry on.
I'm carrying on. All right. So neither one of these men had ever even killed a deer. Brian told his girlfriend he'd let many deer walk by while he was hunting and never even aimed at them. And soon after reaching Mayo, Brian told a bartender that they hadn't gone to David's family's deer camp because, quote, who wants to smell farts all weekend? David, however, thought sitting in a deer blind was a good cure for a hangover. In fact, during opening weekend, David had taken his wife to a party. Now, if you're a deer hunter in Michigan, I can tell you that's not happening. You are geared up and you are going hunting. That's just how it rolls up here. You have a small window of opportunity, and everyone who hunts is chomping at the bit to get in the woods. David and Brian did not blend in around Mayo. People noticed them, partly because David, at 6'2", towered over his half-pint friend, Brian. Plus, they drank too much. Quote, they were loud and obnoxious and getting noticed for all the wrong reasons. There's also the usual animosity that locals have for outsiders. So it didn't help that they made asses of themselves. Locals who saw them in the bars thought that they were just bad apples.
Okay, but can I just interject a little bit here? I mean, I'm from New York, near the city, very urban. So we don't hunt, and I didn't grow up around a lot of people that hunted. There were some families that would go up into the woods and the mountains. And, my father and his family, they did have lands up in upstate New York where my uncle actually is a hunter. But then I moved down to Florida and I met a lot of locals in my area that considered themselves hunters as well. And they were nothing like the hunters that I had known growing up, like my uncle, that, like you said, they're geared up, they're serious about it. It is a sport to them. And they have all the sports accoutrement, you know what I mean, to go along with that sport. They're very into all of the gear. But then there are, I don't know, almost like just different types, different classes of hunters. Because some of the hunters, and self-proclaimed, of course. I'm not a hunter myself, so I'm not judging. But some of the self-proclaimed hunters that I've met in Florida, they are that type where they just kind of, it's a party. It's like camping for the weekend, where they just go out into the woods and drink it up and have a good time and act like they're hunting. And in the morning, they may wake up, they may have a gun in their hands, and they may be acting like they're looking for deer at dusk, but they're not actually, and they never come home with any venison. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's just different types. These guys were those types.
Yeah, but I mean, being up here, and this is a huge place, an area for hunting, because I also lived in Florida for quite a while, actually. The deer in Florida are small and mealy compared to the beasts that are up here. So don't forget, we have all these cornfields and huge forests, because I've been to plenty of deer camps where you're partying all night, but you are up and out before the sun rises to hunt, and then, of course, before dusk. So, and I've seen both, but usually the hunters I've hung around, they're very serious people. But yes, they are partying and having a good time at night. But there's a look, and I think,
Yeah. But what I'm saying is there's kind of different classes of them.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a more apropos way to say it. I'm not trying to be judgy or classist or anything like that, but there's different classes of hunters, and maybe these guys were just...
They looked a little clean, I'm thinking. When you're out in the woods all day hunting, you have a look about you.
Yeah. They didn't look like they were actually hunting at all. Was this their first time doing this?
I'm not certain. It may have been, because neither one of these guys ever shot a deer in their lives. So,
Okay.
I don't know how many times they went up to this cabin, because David's family had a cabin way up there, and that's what these guys would do when it was hunting season. The men go up, have a place to stay, go out and hunt all day.
So they had a cabin, but a little while ago you were telling me how the police said that they didn't know where they were spending the night.
Right, because they didn't go to the cabin.
Oh.
They were supposed to go to the cabin where their family was, where David's family had the cabin. That's more northwest, near the top of the mitten. They decided to go 190 miles northeast to Mayo.
Oh.
Yeah, so they never showed up at the cabin where the family was, where the guys were all at.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Okay. So Mayo resident Larry Barker testified that two men in a dark Ford Bronco pulled into his driveway for directions about 7, 8 o'clock at night on Friday or Saturday night. See, it's real, as the story goes by, it's like the dates, like nobody really knows. Was it Saturday I saw them? Was it Friday I saw them? Was it Sunday? So to this man, it was obvious that they'd been drinking. They were probably totally bombed, and you'll find that out as we keep going forward in the story. They were looking for M55 and were going hunting. That was the story they were telling this dude. Barker saw a television report about the missing hunters approximately a month later, and he recognized them as the men that he had met and contacted police. A man by the name of David Welch would also later testify that he talked to David and Brian at Walker's Bar in Mayo around 9:30, 10 o'clock that Saturday. David and Brian said that they were staying at Ma Dieter's in Luzerne and were deer hunting. They also said they were looking for women, planned to see some school friends in Luzerne and South Branch, and didn't want to see David's family in White Cloud. Welch suggested some bars for them to check out, such as Northwood Gardens and Linker's Lost Creek Lodge, as picking up women at Walker's wasn't a really good place. But by this time, David was pretty drunk and decided that he didn't have it in him at that point to go chasing women. But Brian, he was pretty sober at the time and decided that he was going to go and give it a try. So Brian took off and went to Northwood Gardens while David stayed at Walker's Bar. Once Brian got to Northwood Gardens, he bellied up to the bar and kept to himself. But then a couple of 20-something women walked in and sat at the bar. Now for Mayo, these women really stood out, especially during hunting season, as they were dressed, quote, pretty fancy. Brian called the bartender over, slid him a note, and paid for a couple of drinks for the ladies. Now, I'm not sure what that note said, but I'm guessing it was pretty raunchy, because when the women read the note, they immediately got up and left the bar and never even touched the drinks that Brian bought for them. So Brian finished his drink and headed back to Walker's where David was at the bar. By the time Brian returned, David was so drunk that he had been cut off and was no longer being served alcohol. Soon the two left the bar together, but the two came back the next day for lunch, which was a Saturday. The same barmaid as the night before was working. She said the two were a little hungover, but they were in good spirits. She joked with David, talking about how drunk he had gotten the night before. The men finished their lunch, paid the bill, and left. David had left his red plaid jacket behind and never returned for it. 2 weeks later, the sheriff came in and asked about the two hunters. Beverly Pasternak, the owner of the bar, confirmed that David and Brian had been at the bar. Pasternak identified the men and gave the sheriffs the flannel jacket that she thought David had left at the bar. Cindy Steinhurst, an employee at Linker's Lost Creek Lodge, testified that the victims came into the bar and ordered drinks on a weekend night during deer hunting season. She told police she thought it was about 9 p.m. on Sunday night. Brian went to the bathroom, and when he returned, David was paying for their drinks. Brian was upset that David was paying for the drinks and told her he would kick her ass if she took David's money. Cindy told Steve Linker, the bar's owner, that she did not want to deal with these men. So Steve talked to the men about their behavior. Cindy also stated that she did not see an argument in the bar that night. One woman by the name of Barbara Klemick saw David and Brian that weekend. She lived on Mapes Road, which was about 1.5 miles from Linker's. She was there playing pool and drinking that weekend with her best friend, Ronnie Emery, as they were celebrating tagging his first legal buck. After she and Emery finished a game of pool, they sat down to enjoy their cocktails. She said the two, quote, hunters, meaning David and Brian, needed their asses kicked. She said the shorter one, which was Brian, had grabbed her butt. She swore at him and told him to keep his hands to himself. Later, during another game of pool, when she bent over the table to line up her shot, the tall one, which was David, pressed his crotch against her while scooching by her. She threw a few more choice swear words at him. Barbara would later say that she expected these two men to look humiliated and slink away, but instead, they slapped a couple more quarters on the table and asked for another game. Barbara gave them dirty looks as David and Brian kept playing pool and being loud and obnoxious. So these guys were just out of control.
They kind of sound like just the regular jerky slime balls that go to a bar, get drunk, and have way too much testosterone raging in their teeny little minds. Not typical men, but typical type, if that makes sense.
So the Duvall brothers, JR and Coco, walked into Linker's with a friend of theirs. Now, let me give you a little background about the Duvall brothers and their family. JR and Coco Duvall were the oldest of 7 brothers locally known for thievery, poaching, brawling, selling drugs, and illegal firearms. Locals knew if you fought one Duvall today, you'd fight all 7 tonight. Even law enforcement officers seldom approached them alone. They would wait until they had backup. So these guys were bad news. Tom Henderson, who wrote a book about this story, would say later in a 2018 interview, quote, "The Duvall brothers followed a criminal path and became masters of criminal behavior. They were as comfortable stealing cars at night, cutting them up for parts, and selling the parts as they were as poaching salmon, poaching deer, or tying into power lines to steal electricity for their houses. They were nasty criminals without a conscience. They were killers."
These banditos, the local banditos, they're really that genuine asshole type. But these two guys were just posing for the weekend, getting too much of themselves, trying to be.
Yeah.
So wannabes get face to face with the actually ours. And so what happened?
Yeah. So Henderson also recalled, quote, "a cinematic worthy incident that defines the Duvall's deep, dark nature." This is going to blow your mind. It's going to blow your mind. Quote, "They had an annual backyard barbecue with their friends and family. They worried they'd run low on meat for the barbecue, so they grabbed their chainsaws, drove to a nearby field, shot a neighbor's cow in the head, and cut it up right there with their chainsaw in the farmer's field." Now, I can't even imagine what it's like to butcher a cow with a chainsaw. All the blood, guts, tendons, viscera right there on your neighbor's property. And then hauled it home, drug in the body parts into the house, and ate it.
Seriously, like, I'm not a farmer either, but what do farmers do when people poach their animals? Obviously against the law. No, it's still theft. And actually, it's grand larceny because a cow is worth more than $5,000, isn't it?
A cow's pretty freaking expensive, girl. I don't know how much it is, but
I would bet 25,000 probably for like a full grown cow.
yeah, I don't know.
Because that's a lot of meat.
It's a ton of meat. I mean, I know a lot of people who will they'll go in, like a couple people will go in and buy a cow from a farmer and then they process it and all that stuff. I mean, it will fill a half a cow. You better have a big, deep freezer because it's going to fill it. And I would imagine that, this dude, the farmer, was a neighbor of these guys, and you hear a gun and then you hear chainsaws. They're not saying nothing. They're just letting these, what are you going to do with these guys? They're out of control. Of control, and everybody feared them.
What year is this we're talking about?
1985.
Well, that's not that long ago for the police to not, I mean, the FBI, for Christ's sakes, to come in, and if these guys are torturing their neighborhood and stealing from their neighbors, I mean, where's the law? 1985 doesn't sound long enough ago that nobody was doing anything about this. That's bananas.
Yeah, right on. But you got to remember, this is a tiny, tiny, tiny place in the woods. This is small town, uber small town, small as you can get.
All right. It's just, that does seem crazy to me. Again, I guess it still happens. Like, I guess there's remote places now that don't really, they're not as civilized. The civility of it all is what's making my head spin.
Yeah, right on.
That, I have to fix my own frame of reference and stop to realize that there's probably many areas out there in the world that are, like the Wild West still. That's bananas to me, but I'm sure it exists, I guess.
Yeah. Who knows if it's still going on today? It could be. For them to do this was so emotionless. It was their neighbor's cow, but they felt entitled to it. Why go to a store when you can take it from your neighbor? And that's a quote. Therefore, those who knew the Duvals stayed alert, wary, and on edge in their presence. Soon after Coco and J.R. Duvall showed up with a friend at Linkers, the Duvals immediately took notice of the obnoxious strangers and confronted them after they antagonized a barmaid. Pushing, shoving, and shouting ensued, and Barbara assumed a fight was about to go down. She said things calmed down when she threatened to call the cops, but someone in the bar said the cops had already been called. Next, Barbara overheard a phone call that Coco Duvall had made, where she heard him say, quote, he could use some help. Sherman Heiling and another man arrived at Linkers and went directly over to the Duvall's table. The man she did not know asked where he could get some marijuana. The man and J.R. Duvall left the bar, but they returned later that night. Barbara then was given a 6-pack of beer from Coco Duvall. He told her to go home and said, quote, you didn't see anything and you don't know nothing. That's all she needed to hear. So, with a 6-pack in her hand, both Barbara and Emery left Linkers and drove to her home. They both assumed that David and Brian, quote, the hunters, the out-of-towners, were about to get their asses kicked. To the local residents of Mayo in 1985, it was well known that Barbara was an alcoholic. So even though the cops had been called, they never did show up at Linkers that night. However, someone did call the Oscoda County Sheriff's Department to report the scuffle. Unfortunately, the deputy on duty never showed up. Instead, he loitered at a nearby store, content to let the situation resolve itself. Hours later, about 2 o'clock in the morning, the same deputy, Dick Smith, was driving nearby on State Highway M72 when a black Ford Bronco suddenly bounced up from the ditch and onto the road. Deputy Smith later told investigators he assumed the driver was drunk, but he didn't pull him over because, hey, his shift was ending and he didn't want to hassle with all the paperwork. Real nice, huh?
Are you serious? And he had a job after that?
He copped to it and everything.
Yeah, what the hell? Okay.
Small town girl, small town.
Let's skip over that bullshit.
I know.
What the fuck?
I know.
I assumed he was drunk, but, I was getting ready to clock out, so driver be damned.
Not my problem. Now, when David and Brian were reported as missing and the word was out everywhere, big-time questions were flying at Detective Smith. Quote, was it David's Bronco? Did you see David or Brian driving it? Was someone else driving the Bronco? It's hard to not wonder if things that night would have turned out differently had he just showed up at Linkers Lost Creek when the call was made. Now, it's not known how the Duvall brothers or their friends got David and Brian out of the bar and down the road. Did they go willingly or were they forced? It was speculated the two were lured outside with offers to sell, share, or smoke marijuana. All that's known is that David and Brian soon ended up in a forest clearing off a nearby road. What happened to them was much worse than any old-fashioned beatdown. After leaving Linkers, Barbara and her good friend Emery went to her home, which, as I mentioned earlier, is about 1.5 miles up the road from the bar. While hanging out, she heard some strange noises. So she got up and walked into her kitchen to see if she could figure out what was going on. She heard men arguing and a lot of swearing. She heard one man say, "You are dead, you rotten motherfucker." Barbara also heard a strange metal pinging sound, like metal hitting something. Barbara told Emery what she heard, and the two of them decided to quietly sneak outside to see what was going on. The two followed a path through the snow to a clearing by a fence. They hunkered down, staying low behind some bushes. They saw a Bronco and a pickup truck with their lights on. They also saw several men thanks to the truck lights and a full moon. She also saw the two men that were obnoxious from Linkers. Brian had a window of opportunity and made a break for it. He tried to run away, but the men quickly grabbed and restrained him yet again. The Duvall brothers were beating the hell out of David. All the while he was crying for help. Barbara would later testify that two men held Brian down while others kicked and punched David. At the same time, Donald Duvall was beating David with an aluminum baseball bat. David was screaming, crawling, kneeling, and begging for his life. But Donald was not about to stop. He just kept swinging and hitting him with the bat until his head finally caved in. Barbara said Brian was able to break free a second time and run, but as before, he was tackled and dragged back to his front row seat of what had happened to his best friend David. The men were making fun of Brian for pissing his pants. Now that Brian had seen what had happened to his friend, attention was now turned to him. The men kicked, beat, and clubbed Brian to death as well. When the men started loading the bodies into the truck, Emery and Barbara ran back into her house, and it wasn't long before someone was knocking on her door. Oh my God. Could you imagine how frightened these two must have been, Christine? I would have probably pissed my pants.
I would have definitely been loading the gun. I would have been ready.
Just crazy.
Yeah, definitely scared. And they probably should have played dumb. Hopefully they played dumb. Do they play dumb? Do they get killed? What's happening?
I'm going to tell you. It wasn't one of the Duvall brothers, but one of their companions that were in the clearing during the brutal beating and murders. He warned them both, quote, "You didn't see anything, and you don't know anything. If you ever open your mouth, you'll be killed. Pigs gotta eat too." Days later, Randy Duvall reportedly drove up to his brother J.R. Duvall's house in a black Bronco. J.R.'s longtime girlfriend Eileen Bolesman was there and later told authorities that J.R. yelled at his brother to, quote, "Get rid of that fucking truck before you get us all in trouble." In the years that followed, the Duvalls occasionally stopped by Barbara's house, repeating their threats. Their visits grew more frequent whenever the investigation was heating up. Emery, meanwhile, died in 1995 after stumbling drunk into a passing car. Barbara mostly kept her secrets, only sharing what she knew with Deputy Smith. You remember that name, right?
Yeah, the guy that let them beat him supposedly in the bar. So he's obviously their friend, obviously their buddy, and obviously not a good dude himself.
Yeah, he's a shady cop.
So Emery stumbled and got hit by a car. They killed him too.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I'm thinking so.
He had some loose lips probably, and they were like, nope. We're going to get you. All right, so Deputy Smith, like we just talked about, he was the deputy that was supposed to go to Linkers on the night of the murders, but he figured by the time he got there, it'd be resolved anyway, so why go? And it was just too much paperwork to deal with at the end of his shift. Well, Barbara was having an affair with Deputy Smith, so there was a little pillow talk happening there. But Smith ignored her story and reminded her that she had been a hard-drinking party girl, so who's going to believe her, right? Stellar cop. So I agree with you. I think he's dirty.
Yeah, he's a dirty, narcissistic asshole. Unfortunately, there's that type. They're out there.
Yep.
Okay.
Oh,
so,
all right.
And he was sure he was gaslighting the crap out of this girl, keeping her as an alcoholic and no self-esteem. Great.
Yeah, he's having an affair with her, but reminding her that you're just a town drunk. Shut up.
Keeping her down. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, he's just keeping her down, keeping her self-esteem down, keeping her drinking, and keeping her untrustworthy, and keeping her quiet, like the douchebag that he is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, got it.
Check.
Got it.
All right, but one night in early 1999, 13 years after the brutal murders, Barbara was drinking with her friend Ruth Fawcett when she shared her story of what she witnessed that night in the field. She said she couldn't cooperate with the police because it would get her killed. Well, Ruth took what she was told and contacted Detective Lesneski. Ruth couldn't provide the detective with Barbara's address, but she did give him the general location. So Detective Lesneski, like a dog with a bone, started knocking on doors, and on March 5th, 1999, drove down Barbara's driveway in the woods. Lesneski knocked on the door and asked for Barbara Klemick. Lesneski was the first person to find and question her, even though the investigation had involved psychics, airplanes, scuba divers, cadaver dogs, TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries, 3 generations of special investigators, helicopters with ground-penetrating radar, and dozens of law enforcement agencies. Like, this was a huge deal, and with all that was going on for all those years, nobody ever talked to her. That's how quiet it kept.
Okay, can I just throw this out there that what I say all the time, communication is key. This poor girl is a town drunk, and nobody gives her the time of day probably. And one person gave her the time of day and listened to her and easily heard her story. But what I'm saying is, like, if there's somebody in your neighborhood and they're downtrodden, you should talk to them because they might have a thing or two to say about a thing or two.
They might know a thing or two about a thing or two.
So he questions her, and what happened?
When Barbara realized why Detective Lesneski was on her doorstep, she was engulfed in fear, and she started shaking so violently, the detective feared she was having an epileptic seizure. Barbara, who had since married and taken her husband's name, which was now Boudreaux, she told Lesneski, quote, "You're going to get me killed," and tried slamming the door. The detective blocked it with his foot, the only time in his career he did so, and eased his way inside while talking reassuringly. Barbara kept shaking and crying and said again that Lesneski would get her killed. He begged her to help and said he would solve the murders if it took the rest of his life to do so. Now, this is the Dudley Do-Right. This is complete opposite yin and yang between him and Deputy Smith.
Yeah. And thankfully, I'm very grateful that we do have a lot of those cops as well, and very few scumbags like the other guy.
Yes, cheers to that. Still, she only told him what had happened in the bar, and that she heard screams later that night back in the woods. Lesneski knew she was not sharing all she knew, and spent nearly, listen to this, you're not going to believe this, spent nearly 2.5 years gaining her trust by fixing her roof, cutting firewood for her, replacing a fence for her, and other favors. Talk about do whatever it takes to get to solve a case, right?
So he, what did he do? Move to her neighborhood and befriend her so nobody knew he was a detective looking into the case? I don't understand. Why was he in that town for so long and nobody caught wind that he was investigating?
Yeah, I don't know if he was just plain clothes in it. And I mean, this guy was going to do whatever it took. So if he moved there, I'm assuming he would have, or maybe he just pops in now and then to fix a roof. I don't know exactly where he's from. I don't know if he's from Lansing area or where. I don't know. So meanwhile, Lesneski often visited the Duvals alone, which took a lot of courage, if you ask me. Lesneski was a tall, strong man who competed in triathlons, and he wasn't afraid of the Duvals. He treated the Duvals politely and respectfully, but with each visit, he would remind them he wasn't going away. Eventually, the state police and attorney general thought they could convict JR and Coco Duvall and subpoenaed Barbara's testimony. During that interrogation, she paused, turned off Lesneski's tape recorder, and asked him, quote, "You know I was there, don't you? You know I saw everything." She then described the brutal killing she and Emery witnessed. At this point, it's 18 years later. Jurors at the Aranac County Courthouse in Standish took only 2 hours to convict the 2 Duvall brothers of the premeditated first-degree murders of David Till and Brian Ognjan. The killers Donald Coco Duvall, and Raymond J.R. Duvall, ages 33 and 34, when they committed the murders, used an aluminum baseball bat to beat David and Brian to death with the help of 3 other men who were never positively identified or charged in the murders. Jurors found the Duvall brothers guilty of the double homicide, even though investigators never found David or Brian's remains, or any of their possessions, such as their hunting gear, a .45 revolver, Brian's Marlin lever action .35 caliber rifle, or David's 12-gauge Ithaca shotgun, or his Ford Bronco. The lack of physical evidence wasn't that big of a surprise, given the Duvall's criminal skills along with their reputation for silencing others. Tom Henderson is the author of the book Darker Than Night, written in 2006 for the True Crime Library series by St. Martin's Press. The nearly 400-page book details the grisly murders, what led to them, and how a dogged state police detective named Robert Bronco Lesneski finally cracked the case after finding the only surviving eyewitness and gaining her trust. Henderson said, quote, "The Duvalls were part of an extended family of felons who were involved in just about any crime you can imagine. No one wanted to make their life harder by squealing on them." Witnesses at the Duvalls' October 2003 murder trial said the brothers discussed the killings while drinking with family and friends. The eyewitnesses said they overheard the Duvalls say they chopped up the bodies, sent the parts through a tree chipping machine, and then fed the remains to pigs on their backwoods property. The brothers also physically beat their wives, friends, and girlfriends to ensure their silence, reminding them, quote, "Pigs have to eat too."
15, they said that to Barbara 15 years ago. Pigs got to eat too. They say it to their girlfriends and wives after beating them because apparently that's what they did. I mean, and pigs will eat everything except for metal. They will eat it.
Eat it up and love it.
Crazy, yeah.
Yep.
But the Bronco and they haven't dredged those lakes. They might find a Bronco someday.
Well, and don't forget that the Duvall boys, they were super good at their job because they would steal cars, bust them down into parts so that they were not traceable, right? So that was
Yeah, they knew how to chop them.
Yeah. So the Duvall family and their friends dismissed such claims as rumors, and the 2 brothers proclaimed their innocence when testifying at their trial. The brothers couldn't deny, however, that they raised pigs, owned and operated chainsaws and tree removal equipment, and were expert at cutting cars and trucks into untraceable parts for resale. Barbara's account, along with 6 others who testified against the Duvall brothers at their 2003 trial in October, convicted and sent them to prison for life. Henderson, the author, said the passage of time since the murders eliminated evidence and several people's testimony, but aged improved Barbara's credibility. She was now a 57-year-old grandmother during the trial and no longer the wild, hard-drinking party girl she was 20 years earlier. She died in 2007 in December at Grayling, Michigan Hospital. Now, besides Emery, 3 others linked to the case died in the decade before the trial. As you would expect, the Duvalls appealed their convictions, but they didn't get anywhere with that. They'll die in prison without the possibility of parole. Police investigated other tips about missing evidence in subsequent years without success. While searching for new evidence in Mentor Township near Mayo in September of 2009, Lesneski told the Ogden County Herald he had received approximately 900 tips on the case and felt duty-bound to follow up on each and every one of them. He said, quote, "It's important for the investigation to continue to bring closure to the victims, families, and friends. What if it was somebody you loved?" Now, if you're interested in reading Darker Than Night, you can find it on Amazon, and I've included the link in the show notes. Girl, that is one crazy story.
Bonkers. The most bonkers thing about it, though, that I'm like kind of stuck on is this is 1985. Is that what you said?
Yep.
1985, and this wild, wild west family, like, was holding their town kind of hostage with their badness, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I'm hung up on that. Like, 85, I feel like that shouldn't have been happening. But then again, I guess it's all in retrospect because in the 80s and early 90s, there were a lot of inner city towns that were getting taken over by gangs and stuff, and that was a big thing back then. So I guess it kind of makes sense. I don't know. I'm hung up on that. The whole dirty cop in the woods kind of thing. It's very cinematic.
Very small town.
But this is really one out of the storybooks.
It just blew my mind. Like, how brutal can you get? All right, everyone. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you so much for coming back and listening. Thank you, everybody. Keep coming back. We have so many more stories to tell you. So have a great week, everyone, and we will see you back on Round Robin.
See you next time, guys. Bye.
Bye.